Okay, we're going to read Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying, and she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I shall give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now it came about in those days, when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And he went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" And so they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. And what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat." And Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom. For he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. We'll go back to verse 1, and we'll only go through the 15 verses today. I think there'll be plenty to talk about and think about in those. And actually, just to set the stage before we start in chapter 2, verse 1, I want us to go back to Genesis for real. Genesis chapter 15. And we'll set the stage for chapter 2. So this is Genesis chapter 15, beginning in verse 13. And this is when God cut covenant with Abraham. And when we study that out, Abraham cut the animals in 2, and then God walked between the pieces. And when you did a covenant, it's called cutting covenant. What he was saying was, if I don't do what I'm tell you I'm going to do, may it happen to me as happened to these animals. It was a very serious covenant. It was just a very serious covenant. So here we have, beginning in chapter 15, verse 13, and God said to Abram, know for certain. And like I said, he's just walked through the pieces, and that means what I'm about to say will take place. Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So God's telling Abraham way early in Israel's history that he can know for certain that they are going to be enslaved by a foreign nation. He tells them right up front, you will. I just can't help but think about these feel-good preachers that promise nothing but blessing for God's people, and that's just such a lie. Sometimes we have hard times, and God's telling him right up front, you will be enslaved by a foreign nation. And you'll be enslaved and oppressed. And he tells them it's going to last 400 years. He tells them you can know for certain. And then he promises that the nation that enslaves them, he will judge. And they will come out from their slavery with many possessions. So we'll see all of this fulfilled in the book of Exodus. So, but I'm just going to put my little plug in for biblical prophecy. We're studying Daniel on Sunday nights at our church, and this promise was not given so that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob could spend the rest of their life trying to figure out which country is going to enslave them. That wasn't the point. The point was he gave them this promise so that when they've been in slavery, like we just read, they've been in slavery for 400 years, they're being oppressed, they don't think God's abandoned them. They have this hope, they have this promise, a promise of deliverance, a promise of bringing back to the land of Israel. And so they know how long it's going to be. It's just, there's so much hope in the promises of God. If you know this promise and you can cling to this promise, there's so much comfort and so much hope in knowing His Word and His promises. So that's the only thing that would sustain them through those hard times. And I want to read one more, but make note here while we're doing this, that in the 4th generation they shall return here. And he's there at the time it's called the land of Canaan. We know it as the land of Israel, or the promised land, because he's promised to bring them back and give them this land. And then, while we're still in Genesis, let's go to 17, and we'll read. I'm going to go ahead and read 1 through 6, just because it's good. Now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I will make you the father of a multitude of nations, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. And so this is the covenant, again, that he established with Abraham. And as we went throughout Genesis, he gave this same promise over and over. He's promised to multiply them. What does he say? Make them exceedingly fruitful. Multiply you exceedingly, and bring you back to the land of promise. Bring you back there. Those are the promise, and he makes them over and over and over. We'll only look at these two today, but if you want more references, I can give them to you. So that was the promise. Now let's flash forward to Exodus, and we'll read a few verses from chapter 1. I said we'd start in 8. We're actually going to read 7 too, well, actually 6. We'll start with 6. I know. Exodus chapter 1, verse 6. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Okay, so we're seeing God made a promise, and now God's fulfilling his promise, because that's what he does. So the application today. God's word is true. You can count on his word to be true. You can trust in his promises. Verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. That's a huge statement to the way God fulfilled that promise. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war, they also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So Pharaoh's concern here, and he's going to oppress them with bitter lives. He's going to oppress them terribly. But his reason is lest they multiply, and then he says, and depart from the land. Those are the two promises God made, that they will multiply, be exceedingly great, and they will go back to the land of promise. And this Pharaoh is saying, I'm going to make sure they don't multiply, and I'm going to make sure they don't depart from Egypt. So it's just such you see here, so when we read later that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, just know that hardness is already there. And he's going to pass it on to the next Pharaoh. But it's just a hardness of heart to oppose God and to oppose his word. Which also makes me think of when he gave that prophecy or the promise that he would multiply them greatly, but he said they would be afflicted for a long period of time. He doesn't tell us those things in advance so that we can fight it or that we can make sure what he promised doesn't happen. That's not why. He tells us so that when the time comes, I love the way Peter says it, so you don't act as if something strange is happening to you because you've already been warned. And so that's why it's just a comfort to know he knew and he saw it and it'll be okay. Okay.
I think it's also a lesson in history.
Oh my
in
goodness.
Teaching our generations to come where they came from, because
Mm-hmm.
had they been taught, the Pharaoh, had he been taught when he was young about Joseph,
Mm-hmm.
he would know him. He
Yes.
would know who he was. But they neglected to teach that portion of history. And because
Yes.
of that, which I know was in God's plan, but still.
I know,
And I think it's for us as a nation. We refuse to teach the generations
Yes.
after us, and look at what is happening.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Okay, so we see a little insight into Pharaoh's heart, and then verse 11. So the Pharaoh appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them. Just listen to the language. Afflict them with hard labor. They built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithon and Ramesses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. And the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and I'm not sure what they did to compel them to labor rigorously, but they did. And they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. So this is serious oppression. I mean, it was hard. Their lives were bitter. And Pharaoh had 3 plans. So plan A, he's going to impose all this hard, bitter life, make their lives miserable so they won't multiply. Well, then they continue to multiply. Plan B, he's going to get these midwives and he's going to intimidate them and try to get them to kill the Hebrew baby boys as they're being born. Well, they don't fear him, they fear God. And so then plan C. It was actually in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. When those plans did not work, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So here he commands his people to do this. Every son. And I just can't even imagine. I mean, yeah. Okay, so then in verse 2. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. So this is going to be important later. We learned that all those under Israel are the nation of Israel. And then the next generation, the sons, that's where we get the tribes. So he's going to be born in the tribe of Levi. And then later we're going to learn which clan. So the tribe of Levi, both mother and father are Levites. And then verse 2, and the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. And I think we'll go ahead and look at, we're going to be back and forth, so just mark Hebrews chapter 11, because we're going to be there, and Acts chapter 7, and it's just going to be back and forth, back and forth. The New Testament gives so much insight into this text. It's really good. So just leave a marker here because we will be back. And I just wanted you to see in Hebrews 11:23. So Hebrews 11:23. So Hebrews 11:23, and it says, I'll wait for one. Hebrews 11:23. It was by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So I just want that to be very clear. It's just like our the midwives. They did not fear the king. They feared God. And it's out of faith. And that by faith, that means they had a promise of God that they believed. And so they went with the promise of God rather than the threat of the Pharaoh. Okay, so back to Exodus. So Exodus 2:2, and the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. So she didn't hide him out of fear. She hid him out of faith. So she believed, she knew a promise of God, she believed it, and just would cling to it. And verse 3, and when she could hide him no longer, and notice it's the mom mentioned here. I just think it's fascinating, all the women, starting with the midwives, and now we have Moses' mother. So then verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket. And I don't know why they translate it wicker basket. The original Hebrew is the exact same word used for Noah's ark. So she hid him in an ark, and it's the exact same word. Some translations do have ark. Yes, this one just doesn't. So she put him in an ark, and it's the exact same word. It's so fascinating because in an ark to be saved from judgment. And she put him in an ark, covered it with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. So I guess she's following orders. No one said don't put him in a wicker basket first. She put her son in the Nile.
All right. I hadn't thought about that.
And I mean, this is just, we're so full of, I don't know if you call them ironies, or I like to think of it as like perfect justice, but where he's throwing all the baby boys into the river of life. It's how they refer to the Nile as the river of life. It was their livelihood, the only way Egypt could exist was because of the Nile, and they referred to it as a river of life in their poetry. And so then he's throwing the baby boys in and turning it into a river of death. And then it's so interesting because later we're going to see the whole Egyptian army, God's going to drown them. So drown the Hebrew boys, then God's going to later drown the entire Egyptian army. Just
Some theologians, Don, say that while it looks like it was a group of coincidence, more likely it was God's destiny, and He had this all
absolutely,
laid out,
it is.
and that more than likely Jochebed and the mother of
Yes.
Moses got that revelation and
Yes.
understood that. So there was a lot more going on here than is
Yes.
spelled out in the scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other fascinating thing. God's name's not mentioned, which
No.
we have the same thing in Esther. And I always think of Esther as the perfect justice, with Haman and Mordecai. And this is the same thing. I mean, it's the same. It's just perfect justice.
But we know these people were so religious and so faithful to the Lord
Yes.
that there had to be prayer and all of
Yes.
this worship going on. And God spoke to these people.
Yes,
This
yes.
was a time when God did speak to people.
Yeah, He's going to comfort them, and that's why He gives His promises, and He tells us in advance what's going to happen, and it's intended to be a comfort to us. Revelation 1:1-3 says, "Blessed are those who read, who hear, and who keep the words of this prophecy, who treasure it, not who figure it out, not who spin their wheels trying to figure out who or what or when." That wasn't the point. The point was when you treasure it and then the time comes, it's such a comfort. Because you don't feel like something strange is happening. You know God's in it's just such a reminder that He's in control and He saw this. And another thing, you mentioned names. It's very fascinating. No names are mentioned. Even though Moses is writing this, he would have certainly known his parents' name and his sister's name. He just doesn't mention him by name. Just FYI, I don't know.
What was that again, Dawn? Revelations what?
Chapter 1, verses 1-3.
And blessed are those who...
Read, hear, and keep the words of this prophecy. And I mean, it's the keeping, it's the treasuring, like a keepsake. You guard it, you treasure it, you store it up, and then it proves to be such a comfort to us. When He says blessed are those who do that, He is not even exaggerating. So we read it and we hear it. There's nothing about understanding. There's nothing about this is a riddle, figure it out. None of that. It's just read it, hear it, and believe it with all of your heart, and it will prove to be a comfort to you and a blessing. Okay. Okay, then we have, where was I? So verse 3, and when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket or an ark, covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister, again a girl and nameless, stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. Okay, and we know her name is Miriam, but I don't know how old she would have been at this time. I don't know. But here she is, and she's watching this, and I don't know. So the king is the one who made this, the Pharaoh makes this edict to kill all the Hebrew baby boys. And then she sees the king's daughter go out and find it, get the basket, peek in. We're going to see she was so sharp thinking on her feet. Then the daughter, okay, we've read that. Verse 6, when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So the one that was supposed to drown in the Nile, not be saved in the Nile. And she knew as a Hebrew, probably because he was circumcised. He was probably circumcised according to their, their covenant. And then verse 7, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I shall give you your wages. So now Moses' mother is being paid to nurse him. They usually nursed for 3 years, is what I understand. It'd be about 3 years before they would wean him.
You know, the old wives' tale was that as long as you were nursing, you would not get pregnant.
Yes, yes.
So did she keep him 3 years
Yeah.
with her to nurse him continually? And it
I mean,
makes you wonder
that's
how
the
you-
way, that's the way it reads to me.
So she must have put out the word to not hurt that baby.
Yes, yes, that's a good point. Okay, so verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So he's adopted into the Pharaoh's household as a grandson, I guess. And she named him Moses. So Pharaoh's daughter names him. She names him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. And I guess Moses means to be drawn out. Okay. Okay.
I just wonder if he had a name, if the mom was calling him something weird.
I know. Yeah, we just
Names
don't
like
know.
a Ruby.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know.
That's
So
why
it makes you wonder if she visited while he was a baby, come and see how he was
Bond
doing.
or-
And then did she bond with his mother?
And I'm thinking the prayers and the teaching that must have gone into Moses as he was nursing. And yeah.
If you let your imagination roam, you have to imagine that Pharaoh's daughter did visit him,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise Pharaoh's people would have
Right.
found this child and created all kinds of
Exactly. It would have been a real right.
So,
So it kind of makes you think that it was probably known that
or
this was
even
Pharaoh's.
that the child's mother took him to the castle or the
Yes.
palace or whatever it was, and he visited there with her. She
Mhm.
went with him and took him there to visit. You know, if you let your imagination
Yes,
roam. Because
right.
There had to be some relationship or it would have
Yes.
created more.
And we
problems.
don't ever want to lose sight. These are very real people with
Oh,
very
yes.
real emotions and yes. And so
So the
yeah.
Pharaoh had to be involved somewhere in this child's
he had to
early
have known
years.
what was going on. Otherwise, he would have been drowned by Pharaoh's people. Mm-hmm.
I wonder, did she have children? Could she not have
I
children? What would
know.
make her want a Hebrew baby?
I don't.
And then when Moses' mother brings him to Pharaoh's daughter, it just reminds me of Hannah taking
Mhm.
Samuel to the temple.
Yes.
And almost how much more faith that
Yes.
Moses' mother would have to have, knowing I am, dedicating this child to God, but I'm giving him to the people that are against us and
Yes,
against God.
your enemies.
It
Yes.
seems like that would take a lot
Of course,
more faith.
I don't think they knew it was his mother.
Sure.
I mean, they just think they're paying some to nurse. I don't know. Yes, but you're right. That's why it's so important they're mentioned there in Hebrews as by faith, and that they trusted God. Yeah,
You
they
wonder how much
trusted God so
training
much.
she was indoctrinating him until that age.
Oh my
this is
goodness.
our customs.
I
I
can't imagine the prayers that went over
Benefits
that.
of just saving her, the
Yes.
grace that she had to have those
Yes.
3 years.
Yes, yes, but she did it all in faith. I mean, it's a I trust God act. Okay.
Well, and it was too, for her, a mother, it's better than the alternative, which would have been a certain death.
Yes, right, exactly. Yes. Okay. Exodus chapter. Well, unless we have another question or thought on this point. So by the time we get to verse 11, a lot of time has passed. We're going to flash forward 40 years. I'm going to read 1 through 15 all together, and then we're going to go to the New Testament and read the same time frame from the New Testament, and then we'll come back and look at these verse by verse. But the New Testament gives so much insight into these passages. So I'll read 11 through 15. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So Moses is very aware of who he is. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other, he said to the offender, why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Okay, let's go to Acts. And so Acts chapter 7, and we'll start in verse 17. And then we'll go back in a minute and we'll put it all in context. But right now we're just going to read this account. So Acts 7:17. And this is Stephen right before he's stoned to death. He's giving this nutshell history, Israel's history in a nutshell. But as time, so Acts 7:17. But as the time of the promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. It was he who took shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers, so that they would expose their infants and they would not survive. And it was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God, and he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. And after he had been exposed, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son. And Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. And when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. And on the following day he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, "Men, your brethren, why do you injure one another?" But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? You do not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you?" And at this remark Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. Okay, so that's a New Testament passage. And I just want us to look at a few things. Notice that as the time of the promise was approaching, so we know we're ending the 400 years of oppression, that as the time came, the people were increasing and multiplied. What else do we want to point out? Notice in verse 22 that Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians. And so he was highly educated. He was a man of power in words and deeds. And remember that, because later he's going to say, I can't talk, and then here comes, but I just want you to see, he was a man of power in words and deeds. And then that he was approaching the age of 40 when he went down to check on his brothers. So the Old Testament said when he grew up, the New Testament says he was 40. So boys sometimes take a while. That's okay. Yes, he did. You're right. That was just 1/3 of his life. So when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind, and notice to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. He was very well aware of his background, his ethnicity. He knew who he was. And then I just love verse 25, because he said he supposed that his brethren understood that he was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. So Moses understood he was the deliverer. And if you remember, I mean, it goes even all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 when he said the seed of woman would crush the head of the serpent, which we'll develop this more later in the book of Exodus. But, I mean, they were so this is not the ultimate fulfillment, which is Christ, but this is like along the way. It's just, I don't know what the right terminology, but this would be like a mile marker, and Moses is going to, I don't know what's the right, a shadow, like he's going to shadow the eventual Christ, and we're going to see that here. So in one sense, Satan knows this seed of woman is going to crush his head, and which is probably why he was killing all the baby boys, trying to prevent that. There's just an understanding, there was an anticipation that the deliverer was going to come. And I don't know how, what am I, like,
Satan didn't know when that was going to
he
happen.
had no
so
idea.
He was making sure that he got it along the way.
Exactly. And the people of Israel didn't either. So
No.
they're looking for a deliverer. Like, we understand now, because we're further down in history, that was just even Moses' life is pointing to Christ. But in their minds, this was their deliverer that was promised, and he's going to deliver them from Israel. And, I mean, from Egypt, from the bondage and oppression. And so anyway, but Moses understood his role. He understood he was there to deliver Israel out of the bondage of Egypt.
I find it interesting that it had to be Hebrew
Uh-huh.
that told about him killing the
Yes,
Egyptian. Was like,
right.
you know, what was that motive for them to tell that?
I don't think he would have been accepted by anybody. He wouldn't have been
Right.
accepted by the Egyptians because he was an
Exactly.
Egyptian and because he was very good at what he did, you know, mighty
Yes.
in words and deeds.
Yes.
And he wasn't accepted by the Hebrews because he was this pampered Egyptian raised boy.
Yes.
So you really wonder what type of lifestyle he had.
Well, and they may have resented him.
I think so.
I mean, that is such a good point. And then that's where we're going. Putting this whole passage in context, I want to go back and read Acts chapter 6, because we're going to see, just as Moses was rejected by the very people he came to deliver, they reject him. That's pointing to Christ, who too would be rejected by the very people he's coming to save. And
That's part of the problem. And it happens, you know, we see that even today.
yes,
It's like in Iraq. We went to save Iraq,
Mhm.
and the Iraqis rejected us,
yeah,
which was part of the issue. Which is part of what's caused a lot of what's happening over there now, is because the Iraqis tried to throw us out. And now they're saying, well, why didn't you do more? Well, you didn't want us, you know.
yes.
So it's that round robin, that sinful round robin. Sin is the basis of it all.
Yes, and yeah. Okay, I can't even add to that. So we're gonna look at how this is pointing to Christ, which we know Moses does. He's pointing to a greater Savior and Redeemer, who also redeems us from our bondage of sin and the oppression of sin. So in Acts chapter 6, and the great news of the gospel and the forgiveness of sin is just a hated gospel. The world hates it then and now. So let's just read this. Acts chapter 6, verse 7. And the word of God kept on spreading, and the number of disciples continued to increase. And notice disciples, the number of disciples continued to increase greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were becoming obedient to the faith. And Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and signs among the people. But some men from what was called the synagogue of the freed men, so they're part of a synagogue, they're Hebrews, including both Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen. And yet they were unable to cope with the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking. Then they secretly induced men to say, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. And they stirred up the people the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him, dragged him away, and brought him before the council. And they put forward false witnesses who said, "This man incessantly speaks against the holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Nazarene, Jesus, will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses handed down to us." And fixing their gaze on him, all who were sitting in the council saw his face like the face of an angel. And so, then verse 1 of 7, and the high priest said, "Are these things so?" So then Stephen, so remember, these are Hebrew people, these are Jews. They're accusing Stephen, falsely accusing Stephen. And so he's going to give this history. And I just want you to see the point of this great sermon and history. So it goes through the first part, which is what we studied in the book of Genesis. And then he picks up and does the part we just read, and he'll go all the way through. And I want us to go to the very end of Acts chapter 7. I mean, he just we'll cover all of this as we go through it in Exodus. We'll also cover it from the New Testament, so we'll read all this later. And then in verse 51, Stephen ends his sermon. He ends the history of Israel. And then he says, "You men who are stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears are always resisting the Holy Spirit. You are doing just as your fathers did. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become." So the very thing that he said about Moses, he's saying that Moses supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. He's saying, you're just like him. God sent his son to be a deliverer, and you've rejected him. And he uses, I love his speech though, "The righteous one whose betrayers and murderers you've now become." So a fulfillment of the prophecy that he would be the stone the builders rejected. I mean, Isaiah 53, when he talks about he was despised and nothing in his appearance that were attracted to him. He was despised and stricken, I think. I mean, so Jesus too was rejected by the very people he came to deliver. This seems to be a pattern. We saw it with Joseph. His brothers hated him and rejected him. It's just a pattern. And it's spiritual. It makes no sense. It defies logic. So it's got to be a spiritual matter. And they just reject their deliverer consistently. Okay, so that's one. We looked last week at Luke when Jesus was speaking, and he said he went back and explained from, Luke 4:27, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. So we're looking for Christ in the Old Testament, and this is one way that was pointing to Christ, is the way the very people he came to deliver rejected him. And there was one more, like in John, I didn't put it in your notes, I don't think, but John chapter 1, verse 11. It says, "He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him." I'll even read verse 10. "And he was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him." And so it's just pointing to the fact. So it's just interesting that Stephen's given this speech, and he's like, you just fulfilled that. You know, this is pointing to a day when those enslaved would reject their deliverer, and you just fulfilled that. I love the way he ends it. Okay, any thoughts or questions on that? Okay, but with that insight, let's go look back at Exodus. And then we've got one, we'll go. So now we know in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11, now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, and we know here he was about 40. So we just went from being adopted into Pharaoh's household to 40. That he went out to his brethren, and he looked on their hard labor, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he understood he was an Israelite. He understood he was a Hebrew son of Israel, and he saw this. And again, just the oppression that the Hebrew people were under. You see, he went to look on their hard labor, and then an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. So they were beaten, and then he looked this way and that. When he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And that strike down, it means he killed him, buried him in the sand. And it's because he thought it was so obvious that he was going to be the deliverer. And like this was going to be his way of showing the Hebrew people, I'm really on your side. And they rejected him. And he went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting each other. And he said to the offender, why are you striking your companion? But he said, who made you prince or a judge over us? And we're going to say that's a very prophetic statement. And we can answer, God did. Then Moses was afraid, and he said, surely the matter has become known. And then in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, which is to Lori's point. I mean, here's the Pharaoh. He grew up in this household. I mean, that was like the only granddad he would have known, and yet the minute he hears of this matter, he seeks to kill him, which is your point. He's rejected by both.
But Pharaoh knew all the time he was a Hebrew.
Yes, they all did. He was circumcised, and it's probably pretty.
That's what was confusing me.
Oh, what's
Because, like,
that?
well, because I was like, if he's trying to kill them, and he brought him, why is he adopted? Why is he in the house? And I was like, I missed something. Somebody kept going back. Okay, so he did know.
Oh yeah, he
Okay.
knew.
Okay.
Yes,
Hebrew, but-
Moses knows. Pharaoh
Okay.
knows. Pharaoh's daughter
But he
knows.
didn't kill him, or he didn't, like,
No.
when he was
Moses
smaller?
didn't really know until he was an
Well, but I mean, the
adult.
Pharaoh, he knew that this guy was in his house and he didn't do anything about it, but the whole point was he was trying to kill him.
He
Well,
was
he was satisfying his
he was
daughter.
adopted.
Oh.
Right. He's got a daughter, and he was adopted, and he's been educated in all the like
Yes,
he's been
exactly. That's what was
indoctrinated. I mean, he's
But he's daddy's little girl, huh?
yes, yes.
Well, and see, Pharaoh wanted to take care of his daughter, and his
Yeah.
daughter went in there and said, this
Okay.
is my baby, I'm gonna raise him as my baby. And Daddy couldn't turn her down.
Okay.
Well, and
You
you
know
would
how
think if
daddies
you,
are with your
Yes,
girls.
okay, but that was
I
confusing.
mean, you would think if you raise somebody in the way of the Egyptians, that surely they wouldn't. I mean, even if he knew that a deliverer was going to come from the Hebrews, he probably wasn't anticipating it being Moses, obviously.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean. if
Right,
he-
especially
but-
if you're being indoctrinated.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to start to think like an Egyptian,
Well,
and
okay.
yes, and
But I-
In the
but
back of
be
his
immersed
mind
in their
saying,
culture.
I just
If
can't
he
believe that he allowed it
has
in the house. That was my,
daughter,
I said I missed something.
well, God is amazing. And it's, I mean, all of this obviously is evidence of the hand of God at work.
Well, and money, but see, in Pharaoh's mind, money and prestige and education and all of this would overcome any of the Hebrews.
Absolutely, absolutely,
In
yes,
Pharaoh's mind, that meant nothing.
Yes.
It was all the money and education and prestige.
yes. Why would you ever risk
Exactly.
losing it?
And he even put Moses ahead of Ramses in a lot of cases.
Mhm.
Well,
Was it
Moses was a
also-
good-looking, well-mannered person. I
Yeah.
mean, he
And
played
obviously,
the role well.
yes, he did. He did.
Was
So-
there some of his ego too that, well, that God's not that great, it surely can't come through Moses.
Yes, right,
It's not gonna come through this Hebrew. son.
right.
I
That's a
wonder if there
good
was
point.
a big life event that suddenly Moses felt like, oh, I've come of age. I'm ready to do God's work. You know, kind of jumped ahead of God. You know, hey, I'm going to do this for you. And when God wasn't ready, and then maybe that event also prejudiced him against the Egyptians against him. You know, is there some big life event here that we're missing that triggered this event that Moses like, hey, I'm just going to go out and start doing this for God. You know, killing Egyptians here and
Sound
there.
like Cleta, I imagine all these things that might have happened, like the friendship that was formed between Moses' mother and the sister, and the daughter,
Mhm.
and perhaps that friendship continued. over the years.
Yeah, we just don't know. But let's go forward to Hebrews because we'll get more insight.
Well, kind of going with the Megan kind of, I mean, we can't really jump ahead of God's plan. Who knows what's gonna happen, but,
Yes.
but because it does seem like he killed that Egyptian and was trying to be secretive about it, like he knew that it wasn't time yet for this, that's, I mean, because he looked to make sure nobody was
I know.
watching, and if he was ready to make it known that he was the deliverer, he wouldn't have.
Well, see, the Hebrew that was there might have seen. I mean, they're fighting.
Right.
So there's a Hebrew and Egyptian, and the Egyptian's beating him, and so he kills the Egyptian.
So do you think he was just looking to make sure the Egyptians weren't looking, or?
I mean, I think.
He thought no one saw him.
Yeah, he looked this way.
But somehow these two Hebrews did see him from somewhere.
Word spread rapidly.
He saved
That's
too.
what I was wondering.
That's what I'm picturing.
Some guy from the palace came in.
Exactly. That's what I'm. Because see, Moses thought, now he's going to know I'm on their side. Now he's going to know I'm a defender of the
Unless they
Hebrew
were all
people.
around there.
Yeah, well,
and he
I mean,
didn't.
even if it's just the two of them. I mean, I'm thinking he's thinking, now they're going to know I'm here.
From their perspective, were they thinking he's trying to be a spy?
There's no telling. But who appointed you judge and ruler over us? It's like,
My commentary points out that just because what he did proves he's not ready to be a leader. That his time has not come because he couldn't control his temper.
I know there's so many different perspectives on that. It was very fun to read all the different ones. I should have written them down, but we don't know. We know he understood he was the deliverer of Israel, and we know that he thought this event that they would understand. Oh wow, God, and spread positive encouragement. Our deliverer is here. And he's from the palace, and this is, but instead it was the opposite. Who made you judge over us?
I think there was some jealousy involved.
Oh, yes, because we're talking about people. So there was obviously, yes.
After all.
Yes. What's he doing? Yeah. I mean, it could, yeah. So let's read in Hebrews 11, and we'll get a little more insight into Moses, which is what Laura was referring to. And this is so intriguing, and we'll end with a few thoughts on this. So Hebrews 11:24. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. So we'll look at that more next week, but when he fled to Midian, it was not out of fear, it was out of faith. By faith, not fearing the wrath of the king. So let's look at a few things. When he had grown up, so we're talking about his 40, approaching 40, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So at this point, when he chooses to side with the Hebrew and strike down the Egyptian, he made a choice, a very clear choice. So that's why I don't think it was lack of self-control, or I think he was making a clear choice. I'm rejecting being identified with the Egyptians, and I'm choosing the Hebrew slaves. I'm choosing to identify with them. But then he choosing rather to endure ill treatment. Knowing the oppression and the persecution, he still chose that over the passing pleasures of sin. So all that Pharaoh had to offer, the wealth, the status, the cushy life, the pain-free, oppression-free life that was offered in Pharaoh's palace, he rejects it and chooses rather to humble himself, take on the slave status, and the oppression, and to be identified with God's people. But how do you do that? How? And look, he considered the reproach of Christ, and I think it's interesting talking Old Testament. But we're considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. We know that just as sure as persecution was promised to the Israelites then, we too have the New Testament, and it's very clear. We're going to look at some. It's very clear that those who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. We will endure suffering. Now, the degree to which we endure that will vary. Generation, country, where you live, those things vary. But it's very clear, and we talked about this summer. If we faithfully and truthfully proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, it will be hated and rejected by the world. If you figure out a way to present the gospel and not be persecuted, you compromise the gospel. Because God's word, you cannot trick God. You cannot trick him and defy his word and prove him wrong by preaching a gospel that the world loves. So if the world loves you, you're not faithful to the gospel. And if you're faithful to the gospel, the world will hate you and persecute you. Period. And we've been told, we've been warned. And but the only way we can endure that, which Abby and her boldness, the people overseas we were talking about being persecuted, the only way we can remain bold, respectfully get bold, and uncompromising is to understand, as Moses did, he was looking forward to the reward. And understanding the reproach of Christ is greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. So we have to understand, we have to be eternally minded. We have to understand this is so temporary, that there is an eternity with Christ. There is the free gift of the forgiveness of sins. There is the peace of being right with God. And that's a far greater blessing than any temporary, empty, whatever, material blessing that the world could offer. And Moses understood that. And he didn't have we have the written word. We have testimony after testimony after testimony. And we know we have so many promises of God, and we just have to know that those are true and have our mind set on this is temporary, that's eternal, and just be eternally minded. And that's the only way we can endure and be bold and uncompromising. Because, I feel like it's very easy to compromise and we saw Paul this summer. We looked at Paul in Acts. He was beaten, he was flogged, he was persecuted beyond, and he would not quit sharing the gospel. He would not compromise the gospel, even though it meant he wouldn't be persecuted. He preached the gospel, declared it boldly, even though it meant persecution. And Moses is showing us the same example. It's worth it. Just be eternally minded.
And yet in the beginning, Paul was the one that was instrumental in stoning.
I know, Stephen. Yes. Yeah, in fact, if we kept reading, that's when Paul went out and said he began to ravage the church. And he went from home to home, and he would drag up men and women. And yet God's amazing, and he can change a heart. And that's what it means to be born again. You're given a new nature. Okay, let's read through these last few verses. And Kelly, you have them. They'll be such an encouragement to you. Okay, go through this at home. I know. Okay, let's just start with Matthew chapter 5. We don't have as much commentary on these, but I do want to read them. Matthew 5:11. Actually, we start in 5:10. We'll start in Matthew 5:10. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men cast insults at you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Matthew 10. And this is the other way. It just kept growing and growing and growing. So we'll start in 16. So Matthew 10:16. But beware of, 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. And he's talking about sending out his disciples. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. So just make note of that. That means they were religious people. And you shall even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not become anxious about how or what you will speak, for it shall be given to you in the hour what you are to speak. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. And brother will deliver up brother to death. So he's even talking about post-resurrection, because he talks about the Spirit in them. And brother will deliver up brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all. You know, is that hated by all on account of my name? But it is the one who has endured to the end who will be saved. But whenever they persecute you in this city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you shall not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he has become as his teacher, and the slave as his master. If they called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more the members of its household? Therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. And I want you to skip down to verse 34. It says, do not think I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life shall lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake shall find it. He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. He who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward, and he who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whoever in the name of a disciple gives to one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward. So again, that's how we endure persecution, is being eternally minded. And please notice, it's so clear when he says, I did not come to bring peace. He came to bring peace, but peace with God. We can be at peace with God. We can have peace with God. But because the gospel is so offensive, it's a sword and it divides. The Word of God is divisive, and there are those who absolutely hate it, which we just read today. They just, I don't know why, they just hate it. And, okay, John 16. 1 through 4. And here again, Jesus is with his disciples, and it's just prior to his crucifixion. And so he knows that he's preparing his disciples to live without him being physically there. He's just preparing for them for his departure or ascension. These things I have spoken to you that you may be kept from stumbling. They will make you outcast from the synagogue, but an hour is coming for everyone who kills you to think that he is offering service to God. And these things they will do because they have not known the Father or me. So they're in the synagogues, they're persecuting Christians, and they think they're doing God a favor. and then he says in verse 4, but these things I have spoken to you, that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told you of them, and these things I did not say to you at the beginning because I was with you. So he's preparing them, but he's telling them in advance because it's meant to be a comfort. Not a riddle, a comfort. And then skip down to verse, I think it's 33. Yeah. So John chapter 16, verse 33. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I've overcome the world. So I mean, he promises life is going to be hard. It's going to be hard, and harder because we're believers. It's just hard, but anyway, but we do have peace with him, and that's a greater blessing than anything the world has to offer, is being at peace with God, knowing his comfort, knowing him, and just having the hope of the forgiveness of sins and eternity with him. That's what sustains us when life is rough. Okay, and then 2 Timothy. So 2 Timothy chapter 3. I know, we're gonna revisit this passage as we're in, because he refers to Moses and the two, we'll see Pharaoh's magicians that oppose him, and then we transition what we studied this summer, Paul's persecutions in Iconium, Lystra, Antioch, and then in verse 12. So when Paul was in those places, he was beaten, he was flogged, he was left for dead, thrown outside the city just for the birds to eat. And so all of his persecution, he says, and indeed all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. But evil men and impostors will proceed from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. So it's going to look like they're winning. It's going to feel like they're winning some days, but the word assures us, and we know for certain that they're not winning. It's just for a season. It's going to feel like it, but it's just for a season, and then God's going to judge. And then the final one is in Hebrews 11:6. Moving on. Finally, this is our last verse. Again, this is our hall of faith. All the men and women have gone before us and lived their life by faith. It says, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. I mean, that is just what sustains us, is knowing this is temporary. The blessings, the rewards, is the word you see, of knowing him and being at peace with him and having the forgiveness of sins, eternity with him, that just far exceeds any persecution that we can endure here. This is temporary, that's eternal. Any thoughts or questions? So I think the two main things is one, how Moses' life points to Christ, our Redeemer, and then also just his faith and how he just that he made that choice to reject the riches of Pharaoh and his household and all the benefits, the easy life and the benefits of Pharaoh and Egypt, and he chose rather to be identified with slaves and endure hard labor and persecution. Okay, any thoughts or questions? I know it's a lot to digest. Okay, good.
Very well.